In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy newcomer is poisoned, and everyone's a suspect. Only Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and clever mind, can unravel the clues. A broken clock, a missing letter, and a glass of deadly brandy to catch a killer hiding in plain sight.
Chapter 1. The Village Gathering. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking gently. The village was peaceful, as always, with its neat cottages and green lawns. But Miss Marple knew better than anyone that even the quietest places hid secrets. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind her gentle smile, missed nothing. Today was no ordinary day. The village club was holding its monthly meeting at the community hall, and Miss Marple had promised to attend. She tucked her knitting into her basket, adjusted her hat, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. The hall was just a short walk, past the vicarage and the little shop where Mrs. Price sold sweets and gossip in equal measure. As she walked, Miss Marple thought about the whispers she'd heard lately. A new man had moved into the village, Mr. Victor Harrington, a wealthy stranger who'd bought the grand willow house on the edge of town. People said he was charming but odd, always looking over his shoulder as if expecting trouble. Miss Marple didn't trust charm. Charm, she knew, could hide all sorts of things. The community hall was buzzing when she arrived. Long tables were covered with white cloths, and a teapot steamed in the corner. Mrs. Bantry, her old friend, waved her over. "Jane, you're late," she called, her round face glowing with excitement. "You won't believe the talk tonight. It's all about Mr. Harrington." Miss Marple smiled and took a seat beside Mrs. Bantry. The room was full of familiar faces: Mrs. Price from the shop, young Dr. Haydock, and the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, who was fussing over a tray of biscuits. But the chatter was louder than usual, and every few words someone mentioned Mr. Harrington. "He's got money, no doubt about that," Mrs. Price said, leaning forward. Her eyes sparkled with the thrill of gossip. "They say he made his fortune in London, something to do with trading. But why come here? St. Mary Mead's hardly the place for a fancy man like him." "Maybe he's hiding from someone," said young Sally, the baker's daughter, her voice low but eager. "I saw him yesterday, looking nervous outside Willow House. Kept checking his watch like he was waiting for trouble." Miss Marple sipped her tea, listening carefully. She didn't say much, but her mind was busy, picking up every detail. People often forgot how much she noticed. To them, she was just a sweet old lady who liked knitting and gardening, but Miss Marple saw more than most. Then the door swung open, and Mr. Harrington himself walked in. The room went quiet for a moment. He was tall, with slick dark hair and a smile that seemed too perfect. His suit was expensive, the kind you didn't see in St. Mary Mead. He carried a silver-topped cane, though he didn't seem to need it. Everything about him screamed money and secrets. "Good evening, everyone," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Mrs. Clement chirped, rushing over to offer him tea. "We're delighted you could join us, Mr. Harrington. Do sit down." He took a seat near the front, and the chatter started up again, though now it was softer, more careful. Miss Marple watched him closely. He was polite, shaking hands and smiling, but his eyes darted around the room like a fox sniffing for danger. She noticed how his fingers tightened on his cane when Dr. Haydock asked him about his life in London. "Oh, nothing exciting," he said with a laugh. "Just business. Imports, exports, that sort of thing. I came here for some peace and quiet." Peace and quiet. Miss Marple's needles paused. People didn't move to St. Mary Mead for peace. They came to hide, to start over, or to escape. She'd seen it before. Men and women with shiny smiles and dark pasts. The meeting went on. Mrs. Bantry gave a long speech about raising money for the church roof, and the vicar talked about the flower show. But Miss Marple's attention stayed on Mr. Harrington. She saw how he flinched when someone dropped a teacup, how his smile slipped when Mrs. Price asked him if he was married. Then, as the evening wound down, something odd happened. A man stepped into the hall, a stranger, older than Mr. Harrington, with a weathered face and a limp. He wore a worn coat, and his eyes locked onto Mr. Harrington like a hunter spotting prey. The room didn't notice it first, but Miss Marple did. She saw the way Mr. Harrington froze, his teacup halfway to his lips. "Victor," the stranger said, his voice low and rough, "we need to talk." Mr. Harrington's face went pale, but he recovered quickly, flashing that perfect smile. "Of course, Mr. Grayson. Let's step outside." The two men left the hall, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Bantry leaned close to Miss Marple. "Who's that?" she whispered. "He doesn't look like he's from around here." "No," Miss Marple said softly, her eyes on the door. "No, he doesn't." The meeting ended soon after, with everyone promising to bring cakes or flowers to the next event. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over what she'd seen. Mr. Harrington's nervous glances, the stranger's hard stare, the way the air had thickened when they met. Something was wrong, and she knew it. Back in her cottage, she settled into her armchair and picked up her knitting. The needles clicked, steady and calm, but her thoughts were racing. She remembered a young man from years ago, a charming fellow who'd come to the village with a suitcase of lies. He'd left behind a trail of trouble and a body. Miss Marple didn't like to think ill of people, but she couldn't help it. Mr. Harrington reminded her of that man. The next morning, the village was buzzing again. But this time, the news was grim. Mrs. Bantry burst into Miss Marple's cottage just after breakfast, her face flushed. "Jane, you won't believe it," she gasped. "Mr. Harrington's dead." Miss Marple set down her teacup, her heart sinking but not surprised. "Dead? How?" "They found him in his study at Willow House this morning just an hour ago. The maid went in to bring him tea, and there he was, slumped over his desk. They're saying it was poison." "Poison," Miss Marple repeated, her voice calm but her mind sharp. Poison was a coward's weapon, she thought. Quiet, sneaky, and hard to trace. "What else do they know?" Mrs. Bantry asked, sinking into a chair. "Not much yet. The police are there now. Inspector Slack, he's new, you know, says it might be an accident. Something in his drink, maybe. But Jane, I don't believe it. Not after last night. That man, Mr. Grayson, looked like he wanted to kill him." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers moving over her knitting. "Tell me everything you heard, Dolly." Mrs. Bantry spilled the details, her words tumbling out. The maid had found a glass of brandy on Mr. Harrington's desk, half empty. There was a strange smell in the room, sharp and bitter. The police had taken the glass for testing, but they were already whispering about cyanide. Mr. Harrington's nephew, a young man named Charles, had arrived at Willow House just minutes after the body was found. He'd been staying in the village, at the Blue Boar Inn and claimed he'd been there all night." "And that's not all," Mrs. Bantry said, lowering her voice. "They found a broken clock on the floor, smashed to bits, and a letter was missing. Harrington's desk was open, papers everywhere, but his housekeeper said he always kept an important letter locked away. It's gone now." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A broken clock, a missing letter, a glass of brandy. Pieces of a puzzle, scattered but starting to form a picture. She didn't say it out loud, but she knew this was no accident. Someone had planned this. Someone who knew Mr. Harrington's habits, his fears, his enemies. "Poor man," Miss Marple said, though her tone was more thoughtful than sad. "Did he have many visitors at Willow House?" "Not many," Mrs. Bantry said. "Just the nephew, Charles, and that housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis. Oh, and Mr. Grayson, I suppose. He went there last night after the meeting. Mrs. Price saw them arguing in the garden." "Arguing," Miss Marple repeated, her needles pausing. "What about?" "No one could hear," Mrs. Bantry admitted, "but it looked heated. Grayson was waving his arms."
Chapter 2. The Shocking Discovery. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the hedges and dampening the cobblestones. Miss Jane Marple stood at her garden gate, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The news of Mr. Harrington's death had spread like wildfire, and the village was alive with whispers. She could hear them even now, Mrs. Price's sharp voice drifting from the shop, the milkman's low mutter as he made his rounds. Murder, they said, or maybe an accident. But Miss Marple knew better. Accidents didn't leave broken clocks and missing letters. She set off toward Willow House, her steps slow but steady. The village was waking up, with curtains twitching and doors creaking open. Everyone wanted to know more about the man who died in the grand house on the hill. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her gentle smile, took in every detail. The postman lingering too long at a gate, the baker's boy whispering to a maid. Gossip was a map, and she knew how to read it. As she neared Willow House, her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, came hurrying down the lane, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Jane, I was just coming to find you," she said, breathless. "It's worse than I thought. The police are crawling all over the place, and they're saying it's definitely poison. Cyanide, they think." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, but her mind racing. "Cyanide," she said softly. "A nasty choice. Quick, but cruel." She'd read about it years ago in one of her nephew Raymond's detective novels. Cyanide worked fast, leaving a bitter almond smell and a body with no time to fight. "What else have you heard, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry fell into step beside her, eager to share. "Inspector Slack is in charge. You know him, new, thinks he knows everything. He's got men searching the house, but they're not finding much. Just that glass of brandy, the broken clock, and papers scattered everywhere. Oh, and Charles, Harrington's nephew, was there this morning, looking pale as a ghost. He says he was at the Blue Boar Inn all night, but nobody saw him after 10. "An alibi," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful, "but alibis can be slippery things." She remembered a case from years back, a young man in the village who'd sworn he was at a dance when a barn burned down. He'd been lying, of course. People always thought they could outsmart the truth. She set off Willow House, her steps slow but steady. The village was waking up, with curtains twitching and doors creaking open. Everyone wanted to know more about the man who died in the grand house on the hill. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her gentle smile, took in every detail. The postman lingering too long at a gate, the baker's boy whispering to a maid. Gossip was a map, and she knew how to read it. As she neared Willow House,
Her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, came hurrying down the lane, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Jane, I was just coming to find you," she said, breathless. "It's worse than I thought. The police are crawling all over the place, and they're saying it's definitely poison. Cyanide, they think." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, but her mind racing. Cyanide. A nasty choice. Quick, but cruel. She'd read about it years ago in one of her nephew Raymond's detective novels. Cyanide worked fast, leaving a bitter almond smell and a body with no time to fight. "What else have you heard, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry fell into step beside her, eager to share. "Inspector Slack is in charge. You know him. New, thinks he knows everything. He's got men searching the house, but they're not finding much. Just that glass of brandy, the broken clock, and papers scattered everywhere. Oh, and Charles, Harrington's nephew, was there this morning, looking pale as a ghost. He says he was at the Blue Boar Inn all night, but nobody saw him after 10. "An alibi," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "But alibis can be slippery things." She remembered a case from years back, a young man in the village who'd sworn he was at a dance when a barn burned down. He'd been lying, of course. People always thought they could outsmart the truth. They reached Willow House, a tall stone building with ivy climbing its walls. The garden was neat, with roses still blooming despite the autumn chill. But the air felt heavy, as if the house itself knew something terrible had happened. A young policeman stood at the gate, looking bored but alert. He tipped his hat as Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, miss." "No visitors, I'm afraid. Police business." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interfering," Miss Marple said, her smile sweet. "I was just admiring the roses. Such a pity about Mr. Harrington. A fine man, wasn't he?" The policeman softened, as people often did when she spoke. "Aye, a shame. They're saying it might have been an accident, but the inspector's not so sure." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to the house. "Accidents do happen," she said. "Though it's odd, isn't it? A man like that, so careful, drinking something poisoned." The policeman shrugged, but she could see he was thinking. She didn't press him. Young men like him didn't need much, just a nudge to start talking later. She turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Shall we walk on, Dolly? I'd like to see the church flowers before the day gets busy." Mrs. Bantry gave her a knowing look, but followed along. As they walked, she kept talking, her voice low. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Ellis, is in a state. She found him, you know. Said she went in at 7 with his morning tea, and there he was, dead at his desk. She swears she didn't touch anything, but the police are watching her closely." "Mrs. Ellis," Miss Marple repeated, filing the name away. She'd met the housekeeper once, a quiet woman with nervous hands and a habit of avoiding eye contact. "And the nephew, Charles, what do we know about him?" "Not much," Mrs. Bantry admitted. "He's young, maybe 25. Came to visit a week ago. They say he's set to inherit everything, Willow House, the money, all of it. But he doesn't seem the type to kill. Too nervous, if you ask me." "Nervous people can do surprising things," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking in her mind, even though her hands were empty. She thought of a girl she'd known, shy and quiet, who'd stolen from her employer out of desperation. Nervousness didn't mean innocence. They passed the church, where Mrs. Clement was arranging flowers for Sunday service. She waved them over, her face full of worry. "Oh, Jane, Dolly, have you heard? It's awful. Poor Mr. Harrington. Who would do such a thing?" "We don't know it was done," Mrs. Bantry said, though her tone lacked conviction. "It could be an accident." Mrs. Clement shook her head. "Not likely. My husband says the police found no bottle of poison in the house, just that glass of brandy. Someone brought it in, mark my words." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile stayed soft. "No bottle," she said. That's interesting. She pictured the scene. A glass of brandy, a broken clock, a missing letter. The clock bothered her most. Why was it broken? Had it been dropped in a struggle or smashed on purpose? And the letter? What was in it that someone wanted gone? She didn't voice her thoughts. Instead, she said, "I suppose the police will sort it out. They always do." Mrs. Clement snorted. "That Inspector Slack, he's all bluster. Thinks he's solved the case already, but he's chasing the wrong clues. I heard him talking about Charles, saying he's got no proper alibi. But I saw Charles at the Blue Boar Inn myself around 9. He was playing cards with the barman." "Was he now?" Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "An alibi at 9 didn't mean much if the poison was slipped in later." She made a mental note to ask about the barman. As they left the church, Mrs. Bantry grabbed her arm. "Jane, you're thinking something, I know it. What is it?" Miss Marple chuckled. "I'm just an old lady, Dolly, thinking about my knitting. But I do wonder about that broken clock and the letter. If it was so important, why take it and leave everything else?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think someone stole it to hide something?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or to make us think they did." They walked back toward the village, passing the Blue Boar Inn. Miss Marple glanced at it, noting the quiet windows and the empty porch. Charles was there, or so he claimed, but alibis were like knitting patterns. One wrong stitch, and the whole thing unraveled. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting basket at her side. She didn't pick up her needles, though. Her mind was too busy piecing together the scraps of information. The glass of brandy, with its bitter smell. The broken clock, its hands frozen at an odd hour. The missing letter, which Mrs. Ellis swore was always locked away. And Mr. Grayson, the stranger with the hard eyes, who'd argued with Harrington.
Chapter 3. Suspects Emerge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's tidy cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. Her knitting lay untouched, her mind too busy with the puzzle of Mr. Harrington's death. The village was buzzing with talk, every shop, every doorstep alive with theories. "Poison," they whispered, "murder." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp eyes hidden behind a gentle smile. She knew gossip was like a river. It carried truth, but you had to sift through the mud to find it. Mrs. Bantry had called earlier, full of news from Willow House. The police were still there, poking through drawers and asking questions. Inspector Slack, with his loud voice and quick judgments, was sure it was the nephew, Charles. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. Charles might have a motive. Money was always a strong pull. But motives alone didn't make a murderer. She needed more pieces of the puzzle. She set down her cup and decided to visit the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran it, had ears as sharp as her own and a tongue that never stopped. If anyone had seen something odd, it would be her. Miss Marple pulled on her coat, grabbed her basket, and headed down the lane. The shop was crowded when she arrived, the bell above the door jingling as she stepped inside. Mrs. Price stood behind the counter, handing out sweets and stories with equal enthusiasm. A small group of villagers hovered nearby. Sally, the baker's daughter, old Mr. Giles from the post office, and Mrs. Clement, still fussing about the church flowers. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Price called, her eyes bright. "Come for sugar or scandal?" Miss Marple smiled, setting her basket on the counter. "A bit of sugar, perhaps, but I hear there's plenty of scandal to go around." The others laughed, but it was a nervous sound. Sally leaned in,
her voice low. "They're saying it's definitely murder. Cyanide in his brandy. Who'd do such a thing?" "Someone who knew him well," Mr. Giles said, shaking his head. "That's what I think. You don't poison a man's drink unless you know when he'll take it." Miss Marple nodded, pretending to study a tin of biscuits. "Quite right, Mr. Giles. It takes planning. Tell me, who was close to Mr. Harrington? I barely knew him." Mrs. Price jumped in, eager to share. "Well, there's Charles, his nephew, young, bit of a fidget, always asking for money, they say. He's the one who gets the house and all that cash now. Suspicious, if you ask me." "Suspicious indeed," Mrs. Clemens said, clutching her purse. "But don't forget Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper. She was in and out of that house all day. If anyone could slip something into his brandy, it's her." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "Mrs. Ellis," she said softly. "She seems such a quiet woman. Hardly the type, don't you think?" "Quiet ones are the worst," Sally said, her eyes wide. "My cousin worked with her years ago, said she had a temper when pushed, and she was always hovering around Mr. Harrington, tidying his desk, pouring his drinks." Miss Marple filed that away. A housekeeper with access to everything. Keys, drinks, secrets. But access wasn't enough. There had to be a reason. "Anyone else?" she asked, her voice mild. Mrs. Price lowered her voice, glancing at the door. "That Mr. Grayson, the man who showed up at the meeting. I saw him arguing with Mr. Harrington that night. Looked like they'd kill each other right there." "Grayson," Mr. Giles frowned. "The fellow with the limp. He's not from here. Heard he was some old business partner of Harrington's. Bad blood between them, from what I gather." "Bad blood," Miss Marple repeated, her mind turning. A greedy nephew, a nervous housekeeper, an angry old partner. 3 suspects, each with a reason to want Harrington gone. Charles had the motive. Money was always a strong pull. Mrs. Ellis had the opportunity, access to his brandy. Mr. Grayson had the grudge, something from the past. But which one had all 3? She bought a small bag of sugar and left the shop, her thoughts spinning like her knitting needles. As she walked, she passed the Blue Boar Inn, where Charles was staying. Through the window she saw him sitting alone, his head in his hands. He looked worried, not guilty. But looks, she knew, could lie. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. She didn't knit, though. Her hands were still, her eyes distant. She thought of the suspects, turning them over like cards in a game. Charles, with his shaky alibi at the inn. Mrs. Ellis, who knew every corner of Willow House. Mr. Grayson, whose anger had spilled out in the garden. Each had a piece of the puzzle, but none fit perfectly yet. The broken clock nagged at her. Mrs. Bantry had mentioned it again on the phone. Smashed on the floor, its hand stuck at 10:30. Why break a clock? To hide the time of death, or to make it look like something it wasn't? And the missing letter, what was in it that someone needed gone? She remembered a case from years ago, a woman in the village who'd poisoned her husband over a debt. The police had missed it, focusing on a flashy stranger with no real motive. But Miss Marple had noticed the little things, the wife's calm hands, the way she avoided certain questions. Little things always mattered. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with new gossip. "Jane, you won't believe this. They found something in Harrington's study. A scrap of paper under the desk. Just a few words, but the police think it's from the missing letter." "What did it say?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but her heart quickening. Something about debts repaid and no forgiveness. Sounds like a threat, don't you think? Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Debts, forgiveness. That pointed to Mr. Grayson with his old grudge. But it could also point to Charles if Harrington had cut him off, or even Mrs. Ellis if she had secrets of her own. The scrap was a clue, but not enough to pin anyone down. Dolly, Miss Marple said, do you know if Mrs. Ellis ever argued with Mr. Harrington, or if Charles was at the house that night? Mrs. Bantry frowned, thinking. I heard Mrs. Ellis complaining once about Harrington being fussy, always locking his desk, checking his drinks. As for Charles, he says he was at the inn, but the barman's not sure. Says it was a busy night. Miss Marple smiled, though her eyes were sharp. A fussy man, locking his desk, a nephew with a half-baked alibi, a housekeeper who poured his drinks, and a stranger with a limp and a grudge. The puzzle was growing, but the pieces weren't fitting yet. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and sent her off with a promise to meet for tea tomorrow. Alone again, Miss Marple sat back, her fingers itching for her knitting, but staying still. She didn't need needles to untangle this. She needed to listen, to watch, to wait. Someone in St. Mary Mead poisoned a man and thought they'd gotten away with it. But Miss Marple knew better. Secrets never stayed buried long, not when she was around.
Chapter 4. The False Alibi. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage, casting delicate patterns on the floor. She sat in her armchair, a cup of tea untouched beside her, her knitting needles silent. The village of St. Mary Mead was still buzzing with talk of Mr. Harrington's death, but Miss Marple's mind was focused, piecing together the clues like stitches in a pattern. The broken clock, the missing letter, the glass of brandy with its bitter smell, they all pointed to murder, not accident. And now, with suspects circling like moths around a flame, she needed to find the truth. This morning she'd heard more from Mrs. Bantry, who'd called with fresh gossip. Inspector Slack was fixated on Charles, Mr. Harrington's nephew, convinced his shaky alibi at the Blue Boar Inn was a lie. Miss Marple wasn't so sure. Alibis could be faked, but so could guilt. She needed to know more about Charles, and about the other suspects, Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, and Mr. Grayson, the angry stranger. She decided to visit the village hall, where the women's knitting circle was meeting. It was the perfect place to listen, to pick up the threads of gossip that wove through St. Mary Mead. She tucked her knitting into her basket, put on her hat, and stepped out into the cool air. The village was quiet, but tension hung like mist, every glance and whisper heavy with suspicion. The hall was warm and cozy, filled with the soft chatter of women and the click of needles. Mrs. Clement was there, arranging teacups, while Sally, the baker's daughter, knitted a lopsided scarf. Mrs. Price, fresh from her shop, was already sharing news, her voice loud enough to carry. Inspector Slack says Charles was lying, says he wasn't at the Blue Boar all night like he claims. The barman can't remember seeing him after 10. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her needles moving slowly. That's interesting, she said, her voice mild. But the Blue Boar is busy at night, isn't it? Hard to keep track of everyone. Exactly, Sally chimed in, her fingers fumbling with her yarn. My brother was there that night playing darts. Says it was packed. Charles could have slipped out, and nobody would have noticed. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her knitting, but her ears wide open. Charles's alibi was weak, but weak didn't mean guilty. She thought of a boy she'd known years ago, accused of stealing because he'd been in the wrong place. He'd been innocent, but his story hadn't held up until she'd found the real thief. Timing, she knew, was everything. "Mrs. Ellis was at the house, wasn't she?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "She must know something about that night." Mrs. Clement frowned, pouring tea. "She's not talking much. Says she went to bed early, didn't hear a thing. But I don't trust her. Always sneaking around, that one." "Sneaking?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrow, her needles pausing. "That's a strong word." "Well, it's true," Mrs. Price said, leaning forward. "My niece saw her at Willow House, late at night, long before Harrington died. She was in the garden, looking at the windows. Odd, don't you think?" Miss Marple's mind clicked like her needles. A housekeeper in the garden, late at night, watching the house, or watching someone. She filed it away next to the broken clock and the missing letter. "And Mr. Grayson," she asked, "has anyone seen him since the meeting?" Sally shook her head. "He's staying at the inn, but he keeps to himself. My brother says he's got a temper. Snapped at the barman for spilling his drink." "A temper," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft. She remembered Mr. Grayson's hard eyes, the way he stared at Harrington. Anger like that didn't come from nothing. It came from old wounds, unpaid debts, or broken promises. The knitting circle moved on to talk of the flower show, but Miss Marple's thoughts stayed on the murder. Charles, with his weak alibi, Mrs. Ellis sneaking in the garden, Mr. Grayson with his grudge, and that broken clock, its hands stuck at 10:30. Why 10:30? She'd seen it mentioned in the gossip, a heavy old thing smashed on the floor of Harrington's study. Had it been dropped in a fight, or broken to hide something? She finished her tea and excused herself, promising to bring her famous lemon cake to the next meeting. As she walked home, she passed the Blue Boar Inn. It was quiet now, the afternoon crowd not yet arrived. She thought about Charles, claiming he'd been there all night. If he'd slipped out, someone would have seen him, or not if the place was as busy as Sally said. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat down, her knitting in her lap, but untouched. She closed her eyes, picturing Willow House, the study with its desk and scattered papers, the glass of brandy, half empty, smelling of almonds, the broken clock, its hands frozen, and the missing letter which Mrs. Ellis swore was always locked away. Something about that clock felt wrong, like a stitch out of place. She thought back to a case she'd heard about, a man killed in a nearby village. The police were sure of the time of death because of a stopped clock, but it turned out the killer had set it to mislead them. Could that be happening here? 10:30 was too neat, too perfect. If Harrington had died later or earlier, the clock could be a lie. A knock at the door startled her. It was Mrs. Bantry, her face flushed with excitement. "Jane, you'll never guess. They found something else at Willow House. A key hidden under a rug in the study. The police think it's for the desk where the letter was kept." "A key," Miss Marple said, her eyes sharpening. "That's curious. Was the desk locked when they found Harrington?" Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Yes, but it was forced open, papers everywhere, like someone was looking for something. Inspector Slack thinks Charles did it, looking for the will." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a small smile. Inspector Slack does like his simple answers. But her mind was racing. A forced desk, a missing letter, a hidden key.
Someone wanted that letter badly enough to break in, but why leave the key behind? Unless it was meant to be found to point the finger on someone else. "Dolly," she said, "do you know if anyone saw Charles at the inn after 10, or Mrs. Ellis for that matter?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "The barman's still not sure about Charles. As for Mrs. Ellis, she says she was in her room, but nobody can confirm it. And Mr. Grayson, well, he was seen walking near Willow House that night, after the argument." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing her knitting. 3 suspects, 3 motives. Charles, who wanted money. Mrs. Ellis, who had access. Mr. Grayson, who had anger. But the clock, that was the key, she was sure. If she could understand why it was broken, she'd be closer to the truth. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and sent her off with a smile. Alone again, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes distant. She didn't need to rush like Inspector Slack, chasing easy answers. She'd wait, listen, watch. The truth was like a dropped stitch. It always showed up if you looked closely enough, and Miss Marple always looked.
Chapter 5. Hidden Motives. The morning air in St. Mary Mead was crisp, with a hint of frost on the grass. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, a pot of tea steaming beside her. Her knitting lay in its basket, untouched, as her mind worked through the puzzle of Mr. Harrington's murder. The village was alive with whispers, every shop and garden buzzing with theories about poison, broken clocks, and missing letters. But Miss Marple knew the truth was buried deeper in the small things people overlooked. She sipped her tea, her sharp eyes calm but alert. Yesterday's knitting circle had given her new threads to follow. Charles, the nephew, had a weak alibi at the Blue Boar Inn. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, had been seen sneaking in the garden at night. Mr. Grayson, the angry stranger, had argued with Harrington hours before his death. And then there was the broken clock, stuck at 10:30, and the missing letter with its scrap about debts repaid and no forgiveness. Each clue was a piece, but the picture was still blurry. Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Ellis. A housekeeper knew a house's secrets, its routines, its hiding places, its tensions. If anyone could shed light on Harrington's life, it was her. She put on her coat, tucked a scarf around her neck, and set off toward Willow House. The village was quiet, the morning sun glinting off cottage windows. As she passed the shop, Mrs. Price waved her over, eager to share more gossip. "Jane, have you heard? They're saying Mrs. Ellis was more than just a housekeeper to Harrington. Sally's cousin says she saw them whispering together, all cozy-like, months ago." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted, though her face stayed soft. "Whispering? That's interesting. Was it just talk or something more?" Mrs. Price leaned closer, her voice low. "Sally's cousin thinks it was an affair. Mrs. Ellis isn't as prim as she looks, and Harrington, well, he was a charmer, wasn't he?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind clicking like her knitting needles. An affair could mean jealousy, betrayal, or a secret worth killing for. She thanked Mrs. Price and continued to Willow House, her steps slow but steady. The house loomed ahead, its ivy-covered walls silent under the pale sky. A policeman stood at the gate, but he recognized Miss Marple and let her pass with a nod. "Just visiting Mrs. Ellis?" she said, her smile sweet. "Poor thing must be shaken." Inside, the house felt cold, as if death had left a chill in the air. Mrs. Ellis was in the kitchen, scrubbing a counter with quick, nervous hands. She was a thin woman, with graying hair and eyes that darted like a bird's. When she saw Miss Marple, she froze, her cloth still in hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellis," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. "I thought you might like some company, after all that's happened."
Mrs. Ellis relaxed a little, though her hand stayed busy. "That's kind of you, Miss Marple. It's been awful. Finding him like that." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded. "It must have been a shock. You worked for Mr. Harrington a long time, didn't you?" 3 years, Mrs. Ellis said, her voice tight. "He was a good employer, particular but fair." "Particular," Miss Marple repeated, her tone soft. "I hear he was careful about his things, locking his desk, checking his drinks." Mrs. Ellis nodded, scrubbing harder. "He liked things just so, always locked his papers away, said they were private." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile stayed warm. "Papers like that letter, the one that's gone missing." Mrs. Ellis's hands paused just for a moment. "I don't know about any letter," she said quickly. "He had lots of papers. I didn't read them." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, but she noticed the pause, the flicker in her eyes. The housekeeper was hiding something: fear, guilt, or maybe just worry. She changed tact. "It must be hard working in a big house like this. Did Mr. Harrington have many visitors?" "Not many," Mrs. Ellis said, her hands moving again. "Just Charles, his nephew, and that Mr. Grayson the night before." She stopped, as if she'd said too much. "Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "He seemed upset at the village meeting. Did he come here often?" "No," Mrs. Ellis said sharply. "Just that once. They argued in the garden. I heard raised voices, but I didn't listen. It wasn't my place." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away the details. An affair, perhaps. An argument. A locked desk and a missing letter. She thanked Mrs. Ellis and left, promising to send over some of her homemade jam. As she walked back through the village, she thought about what she'd learned. Mrs. Ellis wasn't just a housekeeper. She had a past with Harrington. Something personal. That made her a suspect, not just a witness. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat down, her knitting still untouched. She closed her eyes, picturing Willow House. The study, with its forced open desk and scattered papers. The glass of brandy laced with cyanide. The broken clock, stuck at 10:30. And now Mrs. Ellis, with her nervous hands and quick benials. She remembered a woman from years ago, a quiet maid who'd poisoned her mistress over a broken heart. Quiet people, she knew, could be dangerous when pushed. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Sally, the baker's daughter, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she said, "I heard something at the shop. They found a witness, a boy who delivers milk. He says he saw Charles near Willow House that night, around 11. Not at the inn like he said." Miss Marple narrowed her eyes, though her smile stayed gentle. 11, she said. "That's late for a walk. Did the boy see anything else?" Sally shook her head. "Just Charles hurrying down the lane. Looked nervous," the boy said. Miss Marple thanked her and sent her off with a kind word. Alone again, she leaned back, her mind spinning. Charles out of place at 11. Mrs. Ellis hiding something about Harrington. Mr. Grayson with his angry words in the garden. And that clock. Why 10:30? She thought of another case years back, where a broken watch was set to the wrong time to fool the police. Was someone playing the same trick here? The scrap of paper nagged at her. Debts repaid. No forgiveness. It sounded like Mr. Grayson's grudge, but it could also point to Mrs. Ellis if her feelings for Harrington had turned sour. Or even Charles, if he'd been cut out of the will. The pieces were there, but they didn't fit yet. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her fingers moving slowly. The needles clicked, steady and calm, as her thoughts fell into place. She didn't need to chase clues like Inspector Slack, who was probably grilling Charles right now. She'd wait, listen, watch. The truth was like a dropped stitch in a scarf. It showed up if you looked closely, and Miss Marple was very good at looking.
Chapter 6. The Turning Point. The evening shadows stretched long across St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a quiet hush.
Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles still, her tea growing cold. The murder of Mr. Harrington was like a tangled ball of yarn, each clue a thread, leading somewhere, but knotted with lies. The broken clock, the missing letter, the poisoned brandy, and now a witness placing Charles near Willow House at 11. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, hidden behind her gentle smile, saw the puzzle taking shape. She was close to something. She could feel it. The village was restless, with gossip flowing like a river. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, had a secret tie to Harrington, maybe an affair. Charles, the nephew, had lied about his alibi. Mr. Grayson, the limping stranger, carried an old grudge. And that scrap of paper, debts repaid, no forgiveness, hinted at a motive buried in the past. But the clock, stuck at 10:30, bothered her most. It felt wrong, like a stitch dropped on purpose. Miss Marple decided to call her nephew Raymond West, a writer with a knack for seeing patterns. He was in London, but he always answered her calls, even if he teased her about her village mysteries. She dialed his number, her fingers steady despite the late hour. "Jane!" Raymond's voice crackled through the phone, warm but amused. "What's this I hear about a murder in St. Mary Mead? Don't tell me you're sleuthing again." Miss Marple chuckled, her voice soft. "Just keeping my eyes open, dear. Tell me, what would you make of a broken clock in a murder scene, smashed on the floor, hands stuck at 10:30? Raymond paused, thinking. Sounds like a red herring. Killers love messing with time, makes the police chase their tails. Was it really 10:30 when the man died? "I don't think so," Miss Marple said, her mind clicking. "The doctor said he died closer to midnight, based on the body. Why break a clock to show the wrong time?" "To point at someone," Raymond said, "or away from someone else. What else have you got?" She told him about the suspects. Charles, with his broken alibi, Mrs. Ellis with her nervous hands and secret past, Mr. Grayson with his angry words, and that scrap of paper, debts repaid, no forgiveness, hinted at a motive buried in the past. But the clock, stuck at 10:30, bothered her most. It felt wrong, like a stitch dropped on purpose. Miss Marple decided to test the suspects, subtly, the way she always did. The next morning she visited the Blue Boar Inn, where Charles was staying. The barman, a cheerful man named Tom, was wiping glasses when she walked in. She ordered a lemonade, her smile sweet as ever. "Terrible business about Mr. Harrington. I hear young Charles was here that night. Must be a comfort, knowing he was safe." Tom frowned, polishing a glass. "Well, he was here, miss, till about 10, playing cards, like he said. But it got busy, and I can't swear he stayed. Folks come and go." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on her lemonade. "Busy nights are hard to track. Did you see anyone else that night? Mrs. Ellis, perhaps, or that Mr. Grayson?" Tom shook his head. "Not Mrs. Ellis, but Grayson was here, drinking alone. Left around 10, looking mad as a hornet." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning. Grayson, out at 10. Charles, gone by 11. Mrs. Ellis, unaccounted for. She walked to the church where Mrs. Clement was tidying the pews. Miss Marple offered to help, her hands busy, but her questions careful. Mrs. Ellis must be so upset, working so close to Mr. Harrington. Did she ever mention a letter he kept locked away? Mrs. Clement paused, her eyes narrowing. Not directly, but she did say he was fussy about his desk, said he locked up something important, maybe a papers, a will. She seemed annoyed about it, like it was a secret she wasn't allowed to know. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face stayed calm. "A secret?" she said softly. "People do love their secrets." She left the church and headed to the shop where Mrs. Price was gossiping with Sally. She bought a tin of biscuits, her ears open. "I heard Mr. Grayson was at Willow House that night," she said, her tone casual, "arguing with Mr. Harrington. Such a shame. Old friends falling out." Mrs. Price snorted. "Old friends? More like enemies. My nephew heard Grayson shouting about money. Something about a deal gone bad years ago. Said Harrington cheated him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Money? Betrayal? A locked desk? She was close. She could feel it. Back at her cottage, she sat down, her knitting untouched. She closed her eyes, picturing the study, the brandy, the broken clock, the forced desk, and the missing letter. Then it hit her. A flash, like a needle finding its stitch. The letter! Mrs. Ellis had said it was locked away, but the desk was forced open, and a key was found under the rug. What if the letter wasn't stolen? What if it was hidden to make it look like a stolen? And the clock, set to 10:30 when Charles had an alibi, but not midnight when he was seen near the house. She thought of Mrs. Ellis, her nervous hands, her tie to Harrington, a woman scorned, perhaps, or one protecting a secret. Miss Marple remembered a case from years ago, a maid who'd hidden a letter to frame someone else. Could Mrs. Ellis have done the same? Or was it Grayson, using his anger to cover his tracks? Or Charles, playing nervous to hide his guilt? She needed one more piece. She called Mrs. Bantry, who answered with her usual excitement. "Jane, what now? The police are still hounding Charles." "Dolly," Miss Marple said, "did anyone check the study's fireplace? Papers can be burned, you know." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Burned! I'll tell Inspector Slack. But Jane, what are you thinking?" "Just an idea," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. But her mind was sharp, piecing it together. The letter, the clock, the brandy, they were all part of a plan. Someone had slipped, and she'd seen it. Not a big slip, just a small one, like a dropped stitch. But it was enough. She leaned back, her eyes distant. The truth was close now, so close she could almost touch it. She didn't need to rush. The killer thought they'd won, but Miss Marple knew better. In St. Mary Mead, secrets never stayed hidden long. Not from her.
Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The morning sun filtered through the mist, casting a soft glow over St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles still, her tea untouched. The puzzle of Mr. Harrington's murder was nearly solved. The broken clock, stuck at 10:30, the missing letter, with its cryptic scrap about debts repaid and no forgiveness, the glass of brandy, laced with cyanide, and the suspects, Charles, the nervous nephew, Mrs. Ellis, the secretive housekeeper, Mr. Grayson, the angry stranger. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, hidden behind her gentle smile, had caught a slip. A small one, but enough to unravel the truth. Yesterday's talk with Mrs. Bantry had confirmed her hunch. The police had checked the fireplace in Harrington's study, as she'd suggested, and found ashes, traces of burned paper. Not the whole letter, but enough to prove someone had tried to destroy evidence. Miss Marple knew it wasn't just the letter that mattered. It was the clock, set to mislead, and the key left under the rug to point at someone else. The killer had been clever, but not clever enough. She decided it was time to act. Inspector Slack was still chasing Charles, convinced his weak alibi was proof of guilt. But Miss Marple saw a different picture. She called Mrs. Bantry and asked her to arrange a meeting at Willow House with the inspector and the suspects. "Just a little chat," she said, her voice mild, "to clear things up." By noon, they were gathered in the drawing room of Willow House. The air was heavy, the tall windows letting in pale light. Inspector Slack stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his face red with impatience. Charles sat in a corner, pale and fidgety, his eyes darting to the door. Mrs. Ellis stood near the tea tray,
her hands twisting a cloth. Mr. Grayson leaned on his cane, his weathered face hard as stone. Mrs. Bantry hovered near Miss Marple, whispering, "Jane, what are you up to?" Miss Marple smiled, her knitting in her lap. "Just tying up loose ends, Dolly." She turned to Inspector Slack, her voice soft but clear. "Inspector, may I say a few words? I've been thinking about Mr. Harrington's death, and something doesn't add up." Slack frowned but nodded. "Go on, Miss Marple, but make it quick. We've got our man." He glanced at Charles, who flinched. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, the clock bothers me. Smashed on the floor, set to 10:30. But the doctor said Mr. Harrington died closer to midnight. Why set a clock to the wrong time?" Slack shrugged. "Maybe it was broken in a struggle." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But I think it was broken on purpose to make us think the murder happened earlier. Charles was at the Blue Boar until 10, wasn't he? A perfect alibi for 10:30. Too perfect." Charles looked up, his face pale. "I didn't do it. I was at the inn." Miss Marple nodded, her smile kind. "I believe you, Charles, but someone wanted us to think you didn't have an alibi for later. Someone who knew you'd be seen near Willow House at 11. She turned to Mrs. Ellis, whose hands froze on the cloth. "Mrs. Ellis, you said Mr. Harrington always locked his desk. Yet the desk was forced open, and a key was found under the rug. Why leave a key behind? Unless it was meant to be found, to make us think the letter was stolen." Mrs. Ellis's eyes darted away. "I don't know about any key. I told you, I went to bed early." Miss Marple's voice stayed gentle. "But you were seen in the garden late at night, watching the house. And you knew Mr. Harrington better than most, didn't you? Close enough to know his habits, when he drank his brandy, when he worked at his desk." Mrs. Ellis flushed, her hands trembling. "I was his housekeeper, nothing more." Miss Marple turned to Mr. Grayson, who gripped his cane tightly. "And you, Mr. Grayson, you argued with Mr. Harrington that night. About money, a deal gone wrong years ago. You were angry enough to threaten him, weren't you?" Grayson's jaw tightened. "He cheated me, yes, but I didn't kill him. I left after our argument." "Did you?" Miss Marple said, her eyes sharp. "You were seen leaving the inn at 10, but no one saw you after that. Willow House is close by, close enough to slip in, unnoticed." Slack interrupted, his voice loud. "Miss Marple, what are you getting at? We know Charles was near the house at 11. He's the one with no alibi." Miss Marple had her head. "Charles was a distraction. The real killer was in the house earlier, before the argument, before the clock was set. Someone who knew cyanide's smell would be noticed, so they burned a letter to hide their tracks. But they left ashes in the fireplace. A mistake." She paused, her eyes moving from face to face. "Mr. Grayson, you were in the house that night, weren't you? Not just in the garden, but inside. You knew Harrington's habits from years ago. You knew he drank brandy every night. And you had cyanide, easy to get for a man who once worked in trade. You slipped it into his glass, then broke the clock to point at 10:30 when Charles had an alibi. You forced the desk and burned the letter, leaving the key to make it look like a theft. But you didn't burn it all. The ashes gave you away." Grayson's face went pale, his cane trembling in his hand. "That's nonsense. You've got no proof." Miss Marple's voice stayed calm. "The police found ashes in the fireplace, with traces of the letter. And the barman said you left the inn at 10. Plenty of time to get here. You argued with Harrington to make sure everyone saw you leave, but you came back, didn't you? Through the garden, where Mrs. Ellis saw you." Mrs. Ellis gasped, her hand falling. I didn't tell anyone." "You didn't need to," Miss Marple said gently. "Your eyes did. And Charles, poor boy, was just a convenient scapegoat. You weren't near the house at midnight, were you, Charles? Charles shook his head, his voice shaky. No, I was back at the inn by then, I swear. Grayson stood, his face red. This is ridiculous. An old woman's fairy tale. But Inspector Slack was watching, his eyes narrowing. We'll check the ashes, Grayson, and your room at the inn. If there's any trace of cyanide, you're done. Grayson's shoulders slumped, his cane clattering to the floor. It was him or me. He ruined me years ago, took everything. I waited, planned. He deserved it. Slack stepped forward, his handcuffs ready. That's enough, Grayson. You're under arrest. Mrs. Bantry grabbed Miss Marple's arm, her eyes wide. Jane, how did you know? Miss Marple smiled, her knitting untouched. People are careless, Dolly. They leave little threads, ashes, broken clocks, nervous glances. You just have to pick them up. As Grayson was led away, Charles sank into his chair, relieved. Mrs. Ellis burst into tears, muttering about her innocence. Miss Marple watched, her eyes soft but satisfied. The puzzle was solved, the truth laid bare. She'd seen it all before, in different faces, different villages. Human nature, she thought, never changed.
Chapter 8. Justice Served. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of the village's quiet cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy parlor, a fresh pot of tea steaming on the table. Her knitting needles clicked gently, the rhythm steady as her thoughts settled. The puzzle of Mr. Harrington's murder was solved, the threads of deceit untangled. Mr. Grayson, the bitter old business partner, was in custody, his confession still ringing in her ears. The broken clock, the burned letter, the poisoned brandy, all had pointed to him once she'd seen the pattern. Now the village could breathe again. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her sharp eyes soft behind her gentle smile. She thought of the scene at Willow House yesterday when Grayson's mask had cracked. His angry words, "He ruined me years ago, took everything," had laid bare a grudge nurtured for decades. He'd planned it carefully, slipping cyanide into Harrington's brandy, breaking the clock to fake the time, burning the letter to hide his motive. But he'd left ashes in the fireplace, a careless slip that Miss Marple had caught, like a dropped stitch in a scarf. The village was already moving on. Mrs. Bantry had called earlier, full of chatter about the arrest. "Jane, you're a marvel," she'd said, her voice bubbling. "Inspector Slack's taking all the credit, of course, but everyone knows it was you. How do you do it?" Miss Marple had chuckled, her needles clicking. "I just listen, Dolly. People tell you everything if you know how to hear." Now, as she sat alone, she thought about the suspects who'd been cleared. Charles, the nervous nephew, had been shaken but relieved, his weak alibi no longer a noose around his neck. Mrs. Ellis, the housekeeper, had sobbed out her story. Yes, she'd cared for Harrington, maybe too much, but she hadn't killed him. Her nervous glances had been fear, not guilt. Miss Marple understood. She'd seen it before, in other villages, other lives. Love could twist people, but so could greed, and Grayson's greed for revenge was the real poison. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Bantry bustled in, her cheeks pink from the chilly air. "Jane, I had to come. The whole village is talking. They're saying Grayson's being sent to trial next week. They found cyanide in his room at the inn, just like you said." Miss Marple smiled, pouring her friend a cup of tea. "I'm not surprised, Dolly. He was careful, but not careful enough. Nobody ever is." Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair, her eyes wide. "But how did you know it was him? Charles looked so guilty, and Mrs. Ellis was acting so strange." Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice soft. "Human nature, Dolly. It's always the same. Grayson's anger was too raw, too old. He couldn't let it go. The clock was the key, It was set to 10:30 to point at Charles, but it didn't match the doctor's report. And the ashes in the fireplace. Why burn a letter unless it held something dangerous, like a confession of his old deal with Harrington? Mrs. Bantry shook her head, amazed. "You make it sound so simple, Jane, but I'd never have seen it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "You'd see it, too, if you looked at people long enough. They're like my knitting, full of little loops and knots. You just have to follow them." They sipped their tea, the room warm and quiet. Outside, St. Mary Mead was settling back into its rhythm. The shop buzzed with chatter, the church prepared for Sunday service, and the Blue Boar Inn was lively again. Peace had returned, the shadow of murder lifted. Miss Marple knew it wouldn't last. Villages like this always held secrets waiting to spill, but for now, justice was done. Mrs. Bantry set down her cup, her voice softer now. "What's next, Jane? Another mystery?" Miss Marple laughed, her needles clicking again. "I hope not, Dolly. I'd rather finish this scarf. But if trouble comes, I'll be ready. It always does." As Mrs. Bantry left, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes on the garden. She thought of Harrington, charming and doomed, and Grayson, consumed by his past. She thought of Charles and Mrs. Ellis, caught in their own fears, but free now. And she thought of the village, small and quiet, but never as simple as it seemed. Human nature, she mused, was the real mystery. It never changed, no matter the place or the time. Her needles moved faster, the scarf growing under her hands. Another case solved, another truth uncovered. Miss Marple smiled to herself. In St. Mary Mead, she was just an old lady with a knack for knitting. But she saw everything, and that was enough.